Egunon, guztioi ekitaldi... Akopling da. Utsi dugu hemen eta bada espada koplatzen da, ez dakit zeitzik. Bueno, egunon guztioi, ekitaldi honetara etortzearren eta beriziki Kiki Messiou irakasleari. Professor Messiou, is a pleasure to have you in this university, and I would like you to have a happy stay in Bilbao with your family. Nire aldetik, eskola konetatzen nazioarteko kongresu virtualaren ekitaldize azpimarratu behar dut. Antolatzailek atzetik izugarrezko lana egin dutelako. Gainera, behin ikusita zenbat lagunek enbat duten izena aparte hartzeko, egindako lana eta ahalegina justifikatzen da. El título de este congreso, Conectando Escuelas, está sin duda vinculado al espíritu más básico de lo que supone la educación. Además, atendiendo a la vertiente que se le quiere otorgar en este congreso, la conexión entre los agentes educativos tiene que ser siempre necesaria para lograr avances en la transformación social. Sin duda, las sinergias conjuntas nos llevarán a un análisis más efectivo para saber qué necesitamos, analizando nuestras debilidades y fortalezas. Todo ello enmarcado en un contexto real y con estrategias concretas y en un mundo digitalmente conectado, como ya hemos visto ayer a la tarde y como veremos hoy y mañana. Sin duda, este congreso aglutina los términos más adecuados para justificación: red, agentes educativos, transformación social, estrategias y entorno digital. Orain, Kiki Messiou irakasleak honetaz hitz egingo dau, baina eskoletako inklusioa landuz ikuspuntutik. Mi esker guztioi, hezkuntza fakultate honetara etortzearren eta kongresu honetako antolatzaileei itziar kerejetak bideratuz. Eta gure errektoriak dinoen moduan eman eta zabalzazu. Ahora os voy a presentar a nuestra ponente, la profesora Kiki Messiou, docente de la Facultad de Educación en la Universidad de Southampton. La profesora Messiou tiene una amplia experiencia trabajando sobre la educación inclusiva, en particular sobre la comprensión de las nociones de la marginación y el desarrollo de metodologías para las prácticas inclusivas en las escuelas. Es autora de numerosas publicaciones en esta línea, contando asimismo con diferentes proyectos Erasmus Plus en esta línea. Como decano de esta facultad, es un honor y un placer contar con su presencia entre nosotras y nosotros. Professor, you can start your lecture when you want.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here in the Basque Country. I came in Bilbao and then went to San Sebastian 4 years ago, and I simply fell in love with the place. So it's a great opportunity to be back and meet more colleagues this time and more students as well. So many thanks to Leire for inviting me, and thanks to everybody here for hosting me. So the title of my presentation, as you can see, is Dialogue with Students as a way of promoting inclusion in schools. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, I don't speak Basque, but I do understand there's lots of support systems in place for all of you to follow what I'm saying. Honestly, I would love to see what Miriam is going to do here, but I need to be paying attention, so I'll see it at the end. I'm looking forward to see what that looks like at the end. So thanks for all the support for the sign interpretation and for Miriam as well. So I'm going to start my talk by sharing with you some examples, which are real examples, which relate to my work. So my research is about students' voices and inclusive education as a way of understanding inclusive education, how can we engage with the views of students. But the examples I'm going to share with you are real examples that happened during my bus journeys going to my previous university, and made me think about the idea of engaging with the views of students, listening to students' voices, to think about what is happening in schools in relation to inclusion. So I'm going to share with you a real example. A secondary school student gets on the bus, half asleep, half awake. He sits in front of me. At the next bus stop, a secondary school girl comes on and sits next to him. They start chatting, talking. The boy looks sad. The girl asks him if everything is okay. He starts telling me how his father beat her mother up again this morning and kicked her out of the house, and how upset he is about it. He asked the girl to promise that she will not say anything to anyone, that this will be their secret, and she agrees to that. She also tries to reassure him that things will get better. So when I experienced this incident on the bus, I left wondering what happens when that boy goes to school. He asks her not to say anything to anybody, not to share with anybody in school, to be their secret. So I wonder what happens. Do teachers pay attention to this boy when he goes to school, who's obviously upset? Do they know what goes on in their life? And it makes me wonder how many children have we got in schools that arrive on a morning with similar experiences, and what the power of that is, and how teachers can engage with the views of students in order to make sure that everybody is included. So as I said, this is a real incident, and I've got a lot more examples, but I just wanted us to start thinking about this idea of engaging with the views of students, what systems we have in place in schools in order to understand each child that comes to school and their own experiences. So the key question that I'm going to explore in this particular session this morning is, how can school engage with student voice and more have dialogues with them? So moving away just listening to their views and having dialogues with them in order to promote inclusion. So this is the general agenda of this session. And I will be giving examples from research in schools, but also things that teachers can do in schools through collaborative ways of working in research. Before we carry on, I thought it's good for everybody to be clear about some key ideas that I'm using in this session in terms of the concepts that I will be exploring. So the first thing that I will do is clarify this concept, inclusion, inclusive education, which is a very contested term. So what do we mean by the term inclusive education? And then move on to this idea, how can children's and young people's voices help us to understand inclusive education? And then how can dialogues amongst teachers and students in schools be facilitated? And the implications of these approaches for individual students as well as for teachers and schools more widely. So very briefly, as I said, the term inclusion is very contested. There are lots of different definitions in the literature. And the ones I am adopting are the ones suggested by Melensko back in 2007, who, as he describes, inclusion is a process. So we're talking about an ongoing process. It's not something that we're going to do today and then it's finished. It's an ongoing process, especially because we have new children coming in school, relationships change. So this is an ongoing process, and it's a challenging process. At the same time, the definitions that I'm adapting refer to this idea of identifying and removing barriers within a context. So we're not talking about problems within the child, but we are talking about what is the barrier within a context that we need to identify and remove in order to enable every child to be included. ENSCO also argues about these key terms in relation to inclusion. Inclusion is about presence, participation, and achievement. So it is about, first, children need to be there in school, being present, but being present, as he argues, is not enough. So it is also about participating, taking part in learning activities, and at the same time achieving. So participation might be there, but there might not be achievement. So we need all three when we talk about inclusion. And I'm adopting the broad view of inclusion that focuses on all children rather than thinking about some individuals or some groups of children, such as disabilities, ethnic minorities. But at the same time, there is a focus on those group of learners because research has shown that many times those are the children most likely to be marginalized. But I'm also emphasizing this idea looking at all children, despite if they fall into any predetermined category or not. And sometimes we might forget and neglect some children simply because they don't have any label attached to them. So I'm adopting the broad view of inclusion. And Mittler has argued that inclusion is about everyone having opportunities for choice and self-determination. And in education specifically, it means listening to and valuing to all children have to say, regardless of age or labels. So it's not just about listening to their views, their voices, it's about valuing what they have to say and acting upon their own views. So that's what inclusion is about. For me, an inclusive school is one that truly listens to the children and acts upon their suggestions. So in the literature, you see this idea of voices, so students' voices, that's how it's used in the literature. And again, there are different definitions about what voice means. Using the work of Pat Thompson there, who's arguing that it is having a say, being in a position to express your view, referring to language, but also emotional components. So voice can be communicated through the way of non-verbal communication. So when you're going to be teachers, I know many of you are going to be social educators, others are going to be teachers. When you're working with children, look at what non-verbal way of communicating is suggesting to you. So what does this mean? What does express opinion? And Anne Lewis is also drawing attention to the notion of silence. So she's arguing that silence is not empty. Silence suggests something. Sometimes when I work with teachers and others who train to be teachers, the ones that they keep forgetting about are the silent children because they don't present any problems. So try and understand, what are they telling us with their silence? And it's this idea of students' voices versus student voice. In the literature, they talk about student voice, referring to the collective, what all the students think, or most of them think, that we say student voice suggests that they want to go on a day trip to Bilbao, let's say, 75% of them. That's the collective. But I'm drawing attention to individuality, so students' voices. Every child has an individual view, and it's our duty to explore what this view is through different ways of capturing those ideas. And this idea of focusing on the ideas of students has gained lots of prominence since 1989 with the UN Conventions of the Rights of the Child, which emphasizes this idea of children's rights to be heard. So specifically Articles 12 and 13 focus on this idea of children have the right to be heard about matters that concern them. But also, even before as well as after, a number of academics have drawn attention to the power in terms of making schools think about possible changes within a context. So by listening to children, you can think about what you do in schools and make changes and make possible changes. And again, Ensko and his colleagues back in 1999 have argued that they are hidden voices, in inverted commas, that if listened to, may assist in the development of more inclusive classrooms and schools. So in the past, they were hidden. Everybody was thinking that children cannot really express views about schools, about what they are experiencing. So this has changed with changed notions of childhood that sees children as active agents. So in the past, nobody would ask them simply because they were thinking they're not mature enough, they cannot really tell us anything about what's happening in schools. But this concept has changed gradually, even though there are still people in schools as well as researchers that they don't value the view of children. But the links between students' voices and inclusive education is something that we've been working on for a number of years in the field of inclusive education. So this is more about an introduction about the key terms, inclusion and students' voices. And as I said, my presentation today is focusing on facilitating dialogues and discussions with students. So I'm going to share with you some methods that I've used in research and other researchers have used in order to engage with the views of students. So it's not as simple sometimes just to ask them to tell you what they think. Some children would immediately say to us what they think, some others won't. So that's why we developed a range of methods to engage with their views. So this first method, which is called the message in a bottle, and I've used in a number of studies, can be used by researchers, but can also be used by teachers in schools. I've used it as a researcher with individual interviews with students, but I know teachers who like this idea and used it in schools. So I was asking children in interviews to write down one thing they could change. If we could change one thing in school that they do not like, what would it be? So they had to write down what they would change in school and then post it in a bottle that would be sent to another planet and see what happens. And I have to say, many were coming back, what happened? Is it going to change? Because I was using it to get their attention. So there are some issues to think about there, how we use these methods. You could also use it by asking them to tell you as an adult to write down the message, because some children will not be able to write down what they want to change. But it is a good way of thinking about how we can change things in schools and what matters most to children. And I have to say that sometimes the messages that we get, if they could change something in school, in fact, I found that in schools in Cyprus, where I come from originally, in schools in the UK, and my colleagues in Spain, in Madrid, have also found something similar. Many children say that they would like to have a swimming pool in school. So it's nothing to worry about, but it's something that gives us an opportunity to discuss with children about their suggestions. It's not to say that it's a stupid idea, but it's a way to start exploring their perspectives. So the idea in terms of inclusion is to highlight areas of concerns. So we did have children that they were saying, one thing I would like to change in school, it's either stop making fun of me. And before that, the teachers didn't know that there were others that were making fun of the individual children. The other method that is being used in the literature, I've used it and others have used it, is the idea of sociometric measures and the development of sociograms. So this idea is not to be shared with children themselves, but we did it as researchers and teachers did it as well. You give pieces of paper to students and you ask them to write down 3 children they would like to play with and 3 they would like to work with. I always go for the positive rather than asking them the negative, because I want to be inclusive in my approach. So then the teacher or the researcher has all the names there, and the stars indicate the children's preferences. And you can see that some children have got no nominations at all. So nobody wants to play with them, nobody wants to work with them. They were not in their top 3 anyway. So this is a way, and we presented them visually as well. So the initials there, these are the sociograms. It's a visual representation of what we had in the sociogram there. Illustrates the sort of things that happen in school. But I always say, do not just rely on one method of exploring students' views, because this might not be representative of reality. So what we did as researchers is that we use that to do observations in the playground and see, are the ones who have 0 nominations the ones that don't have anybody to play with? And sometimes it was, and sometimes it wasn't. So all I'm saying that these methods allow you to explore children's preferences, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anybody who got a 0 hasn't got anybody to play with or hasn't got anybody to work with. Another approach that has been used quite a lot in the literature, and this is an example from my own research, visual images and specifically the use of drawings. So again, rather than asking children to tell you what they experience in school, you ask them to draw something. In this example, I asked them to draw an incident that happened at school and made them very upset. And it was at the start of an interview. So again, for me, it was a facilitator for further discussion. So here, again, I'm using this from a study I carried out in Cyprus, in my own country. So the writing there, I don't think it's been translated. No, it hasn't. It's not English, it's Greek. And it says, that boy is saying, Kula is her name, you are black, ha ha ha. And she's crying. So Kula was a child in Cyprus whose father was from Cyprus and her mother was from Philippines. So the color of her skin was darker compared to other children. So up to that point, the teachers didn't know that this girl was bullied really by one of her classmates who was telling her she's black and making her feel excluded in school. So again, another avenue to explore children's experiences, children's views. But as I always say, do not just rely on one method, because some children will find drawing a problem. They cannot really draw. They don't like drawing. So that's why we are encouraging you to think about different methods, different ways of gaining students' experiences. Another method that falls under the idea of visual images is the idea of photo voice. So this has been used widely in research, and here children are asked to take pictures illustrating what helps them in class with their learning and what makes it difficult for them. So again, as I said, looking at what are the barriers for these children in a context in order to promote inclusion. So here the students took images of these real objects that was helping them with maths learning. And visual images, as I said, have been used widely. In another project, this is in a secondary school, the previous was in a primary school, I've used the visual images as a way of exploring places that students feel safe in school and places they do not feel safe in. So they worked in groups and they went around school and they took images of the areas they felt safe and the areas they didn't feel safe. And here you can see they made posters at the end and presented them to the teachers to explore again what makes it difficult for these children in schools. Now, in addition to this, the students who took these pictures were then asked to become researchers themselves and explore their classmates' views. So what they did was they presented those posters and then they had word cards with the areas of the school and asked the other younger children to say where they felt safe and where they felt unsafe. And analyzing all of this let teachers and researchers realize that the younger children had other places that they felt safe and other places they felt unsafe, as opposed to the older children. And then the school implemented some changes as a result of these methods. A method that is very powerful in my view, and it has been adopted by Lynn Davis. I've used it in my work, but Lynn Davis first used it to explore democratic processes in schools, is where you ask children in groups, both primary and secondary, we've used this activity, to draw a rough map of the school and indicate where decisions are made and by whom. Who's making the decisions? So thinking about inclusion and students' voices, I once did it with 30 students from 2 secondary schools. There were 2 different schools. One school, it was very clear all the decisions were made by the head teacher. The other school, all the decisions were made in the classrooms by students themselves. So the other school started thinking, what are they doing that we are not doing in our school? That students feel so empowered and that they are included part of the school. So it's quite powerful. In primary schools, we gave them the layout ready to save time, even though if you don't have restrictions of time, it's an excellent way of exploring their views. And if you use such approaches as researchers, it's quite powerful to record the dialogues that take place and write it up afterwards and analyze it. But as I said, this kind of work that I'm involved in can be used either for research purposes or by teachers or even by students who become researchers in schools. When I used this with the secondary school students, and then they went back to their schools to use it with their classmates, they thought they wanted to be more creative. They wanted to save a bit of time as well. So what they did, instead of using the power map that I used with them, they developed the star charts, and one side of the chart was saying, I feel included in school. The other one was saying, I do not feel included in school. Or I feel I have a say in school. I don't have a say in school. I cannot express my view. Or I feel I take part in activities. I feel I don't take part in activities. And they have those on the wall of each class, and they ask the students to indicate by placing a star to demonstrate what they feel about their class and their school. There are lots of methodological difficulties with this kind of activity, but it came from the students themselves, and it made them think. Some classes, they were quite spread out, whereas in some other classes it was clear, lots of stars on one side, so the students felt more included in that specific classroom. So as I said, these methods are only to make us start thinking about what we do in schools. Another activity I adapted from McNamara and Morton. So this is the feelings dice, where you make this in a dice and then children throw it in. We work with children in a circle. We've done this with primary schools. And based on what comes up on the side that they take, they have to make a sentence saying, I am hurt when this and this happens. I am angry when this and this happens in schools. So again, it is a way to think about their own experiences and again, make changes based on what they say. And another method, quite easy, we've used it in research, but teachers also use it for their own purposes, the post-it notes and unfinished sentences. So here we were asking them to finish the sentence, if I were a teacher, I was going to do this. And each one of them writes individually, and then they post it on the walls, and then they go around the room, and then they look and discuss what comes up from their ideas. If I were a teacher, I was going to be not putting students working together as I want, but based on their friendships. Sometimes they say this. Now, this is not to say that whatever is suggested, the teachers are going to do. It's a way of start thinking and explaining to them why sometimes things cannot happen in the way that the students are suggesting. So one of the things we found in research, for example, is that with this kind of activities, you get contradictory messages sometimes, which is natural. Sometimes students say, if I were the teacher, I was going to ask students work individually, and others would say, I was going to ask students work in groups all the time. So the idea is that the teachers can share this and show to the children that some of you say this, some of you say the others. We are teachers, we know that you need to learn to work in groups, so sometimes we do it like this, and sometimes we do it in a different way. So it is about those dialogues and explanations to children, and it is about thinking differently about what we do. And this is not from research, this is from an English school, where this particular school have got the Pubi voice board, as you can see there, and children can go and post messages in that letterbox, and then the teachers discuss about this and make changes. So there they say what changes they made based on what the children said. You said you wanted more benches outside in the playground, and we made sure that you had 2 more benches. That's just an example. But what is important in research, having interviewed children, is who reads those messages. So in some schools, it is the school council that reads it, the student council that reads it. In others, it's just the members of staff. And quite interestingly, the children feel that if the head teacher has a read of those messages, something is going to change. They know that if the head teacher has a read, then things will change. Where sometimes they feel, why am I going to post in there if nobody is going to read and do something about it? So it's important that with all these methods, we share our views based on what they tell us. Not to say that anything that is suggested is possible. So the key thing is this: how do we act on their views, which sometimes might mean not really doing what they are suggesting, because it's not possible to have a swimming pool in every school. It's not possible, but we explain to them why. We don't laugh at them about their suggestion, but sometimes we try and find a common way. And as I said, these have been methods that I've used over the years in my research, and I've been in this field for almost 25 years now. So most recently, I moved into a next stage where I'm focusing more about this idea of dialogues. So these methods are all very good and very enjoyable to be used. The children love having these used in research and in schools. But I'm arguing that the methods are just the starting point for listening better. So sometimes schools, as well as researchers, feel that they've done their duty by using these methods. And my argument is that they are only the starting point. And what is important is engaging in conversations with children to try and see those alternative perspectives. So it's this idea of moving into dialogues. And the word dialogue is used again widely, and I want to make it clear here that what I am emphasizing here, it's this idea suggested by Caroline Lodge, that she's arguing dialogue is a point that you wouldn't arrive on your own. So it's through this exchange of conversations that you get to a stage that you wouldn't get to alone. And I'm arguing that we are only going to listen better if we engage in collaborative ways of working in schools and respect students' contributions. And I keep saying respect does not always mean that we will be able to do what they are suggesting, but it's showing to them that we care about what they think and that we are going to make some changes if that's possible. So, as I said, methods by themselves are not the solution. So it's the idea of moving a step further into dialogues. And I'm going to give you 2 examples from 2 projects that one is completed now, 2011-2014, and the other one is ongoing. These are both have been supported by the European Union. Some of you have got leaflets for the second one, but there's more here to take in the end about the second one. So the first one, responding to diversity by engaging with students' voices, a strategy for teacher development. 3 countries took part, and there were 5 universities. The countries were Spain, Portugal, and the UK. And there were 8 secondary schools in the 3 countries. So we work with secondary schools. So that specific project was focusing on a strategy for teacher development. So how can teachers respond to student diversity? So addressing this challenge, all schools are very diverse these days. How can teachers address this diversity? And then the second project that I'm going to focus more on today builds on the findings of the first project and involves primary schools in 5 countries, Austria, Denmark, England, Portugal, and Spain. But only primary schools, 30 primary schools in total. So the first project, I'll come back to the second in a minute, had, as I said, the countries and 13 organizations, 5 universities and 8 secondary schools. And I've got the website there, so you can access some materials that we've developed that can have been translated in 5 different languages. So you can find the actual materials in Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and German. And there is a video as well that you can see that it's been developed for the purposes of teacher development. So as a result of that first project, we developed this model, which is a conceptual model, the inclusive inquiry model, which focuses on the development of learning and teaching. So we are arguing that in order to reach out to all children, to respond to diversity, there is a set of interconnected processes. So whilst teachers talk about diversity, they are learning from experiences from one another, as well as develop inclusive practices at the same time. But what is at the heart of this process was this idea of engaging with the views of students. So for this first project, what we did was we had teachers working together in trios to design a lesson collaboratively, taking into account what the children thought. And then one teacher teaches whilst the other 2 observe, and at the end, they gain the students' views about the lesson and they make changes to the lesson. And the process is repeated 3 times in order to ensure that we reach out to all children. So this was the first project, and we saw that what was having a significant impact on the whole process was what the children were saying about learning and teaching, because they were bringing a different perspective on the table. Now, in the second project, which I'm going to spend more time now, which we have called Reaching the Hard to Reach. Hard to reach, we have it in inverted commas. Inclusive responses to diversity through child-teacher dialogue. And as I said, we are 5 countries, and the partners are 5 universities and 5 primary schools, even though we are working with a total of 30 schools at the moment. This is the second year of the project, and you can go on our website. It's on the brochures that I gave you. You can go and find our materials, even though it's still work in progress, because this is only the second year of the project. So what we've done is we are taking the same model and refining it to be used in primary schools. And you can see there that we've replaced the idea of students' voices and students' views with this idea of teacher-student dialogue, because this is what we are seeing it's happening, and this is what the project is setting out to do. So we are moving away with just the use of those methods, and we are encouraging through this process to have authentic dialogues between children and teachers, children and children, in order to develop learning and teaching so as we reach out to all children, especially those that are seen as hard to reach. So this phrase, I know here in the Basque Country, I was talking with a group of researchers yesterday, we use neglected, vulnerable children. These are all phrases that we as adults have created, and it means different things in different contexts. So that's why we put it in inverted commas, and we take the position that any child can be seen as hard to reach at some point in their life. So we are asking teachers to think outside the deficit way, or because it's a disabled child, it's hard to reach. Some disabled children might be thriving in school. So we're asking them to think, who is hard to reach in your context? And we are asking them to work collaboratively with their children in order to develop learning and teaching. And a new dimension we introduced is that we are training children as researchers, primary school children. In order to make it clearer, I'm going to give you an example from one of the English schools that I've worked with, my partner school, even though there are more schools this year, that I've worked with last year. So the process, as you can see and as I've explained, is that teachers need to form research groups. Then they involve children as researchers. I have it in red because that's the new thing for us. Then they discuss learning and teaching in relation to diversity. And then they plan a lesson, teach it, then they analyze it, and then that process is repeated 3 times, and they identify implications for future practice. And dialogue permeates the whole process. So as I said, I'm going to give you a specific example from a school in England. So this school, they worked with 3 teachers from 3 different year groups, year 4, 5, and 6. So that's 9, 10, and 11 years old. And they chose from each of these classes 3 children that were seen as hard to reach to become the researchers in that specific time that they were going to work in the process. So those children, one of them, for example, they said to me, he might run out of the session as soon as they see new people coming there. Another one was not confident at all to put up their hand in the class. Another one had recently joined the school and they wanted to give that child this opportunity. So each of the teachers decided who are those seen as hard to reach that they wanted to give them this opportunity. And the teachers were all trained by us as researchers about how to train children to be researchers. So the focus of their training was how to observe lessons, because the children researchers were going to observe lessons, and how to have constructive dialogues with their teachers, as well as how to become researchers and collect the views of their own classmates. So this is an example of the training of the researchers. The teacher that you see there was the teacher who facilitated the training of the researchers, but we as researchers from the university were also there observing, keeping notes about the whole process. And the children, 9 of them, as I said, were all sat down there to start thinking about learning. What does learning look like? So what she did is that she presented a number of pictures and started by asking them, where do you think learning takes place? And I don't know, I know this might be difficult because it's recorded now, but us, the adults in the room, we all thought that it was going to be either that picture at the top or the other one that the children were going to say. And to our surprise, all the children thought that learning takes place when students have their head down and writing down in an exam situation. This is what primary school children were telling us, that learning takes place in that picture. So we started making them think that learning is much more fluid concept, and it's not just looking down and writing down without knowing what goes on in their head. So they started becoming much more critical about what learning looks like. And then after they discussed all the pictures, what they did, they went and visited other classes whilst lessons were taking place, and they observed in the English schools, you've got glass windows instead of walls, so we could watch from outside, and then we went inside as well. And they started looking and saying, well, I saw people when they came back talking, but I realized when I saw them for a bit longer, they were talking on task. So from a distance, he saw those two children speaking, and they said, oh, they're not learning, they're talking between them. And then from far away, I thought that. But because they were talking with their heads down, writing, that kind of tells me that they can be talking about something that's not what they are supposed to be talking about. So even though first this observer thought that they are not talking about the lesson, then going and looking closely, they had their heads down and they were talking about learning. So basically, the idea was to make them think about that it's not easy to be clear when learning is taking place. Then another area of the training was that we wanted them to think about how are they going to talk to their teachers about their observations of the lessons. Because as I said before, they were going to plan the lesson together, and then they were going to observe it alongside their teachers. So we had children observing the lesson and giving comments about the lesson. So what this teacher did, she prepared these statements. The lesson was boring. The teacher talked too much. The teacher is really nice. The activity allowed everyone to be involved. There were lots of opportunities for children to work together. So what we wanted them to see is that if you observe a lesson and you go and tell the teacher afterwards, Miss, your lesson was boring, how do you think this teacher is going to feel? So we were trying them to think about, present it in a way that it's helpful for the teacher, but without making them becoming defensive. Because in the past, we've seen that some teachers might be difficult to accept feedback, comments from students. So we wanted to make sure that the children were focusing on activities, on what was happening that helps learning, rather than saying the teacher is smiley, the teacher is nice. So we had this training to make them think how to make their comments useful and constructive, to allow that space for dialogue, rather than making teachers becoming defensive. So it is about what do you notice? We wanted their views on what they notice, but how you're going to express it, it's something that we need to work on. So at the end of this session, we also shared with them a range of methods like the ones I showed you at the start, because these 3 researchers in each class were going to collect their classmates' views to design a lesson together, taking into account everybody's views. So at the end of this session, they decided, the 10-year-olds, the 9-year-olds, the 11-year-olds, they had a plan. So they went into the class and they were the mini teachers. They were very, very impressive. They stood in front of the class, they explained what the project was about, and they said, we want your views about learning and teaching, because we, the 3 researchers, with your ideas, we are going to design a lesson with your teachers, taking into account what you think. And this is an example of what the year 6 did. Those were 11 years old. So the year 6 prepared a set of statements, 9 statements, as you can see. And they said, these are our ideas. We 3 researchers think that we learn best when we can work in a group, or I learn best when I can work on my own, or I learn best when I can choose where to sit. I learn best when I can decide how I learn. I learn best when I get help by the teacher. I learn best when the teacher lets us get on with it. I learn best when we have music on. I learn best when we have silence. And then they had add your own suggestions. So each of these statements were written on a piece of paper, each statement on one piece of paper, and they gave those colored cubes to the students who had to go around the class and indicate their preferences. So they could vote for as many as they liked. And some put a cube almost on everyone, and others were very selective. And at the same time, they asked them to add post-it notes with their comments. So they were explaining, we learn best when there is music on because this helps me be more concentrated. Or somebody was saying, music is distracting for me. So at the end of this, the children with their teachers analyzed this information and identified what was coming from each of the year classes to design collaboratively the lesson. It was going to be the same lesson. And because it was different age group, they chose a topic that could be used in all three groups. So they chose to do internet safety. Now this year, they are using all year fours working together, and they are doing literacy and maths and other topics. But last year, they chose this as a topic because it was going to be in three different groups. So here you can see the children researchers with the teachers. So they presented their findings, and the ideas that came from all three classes, some of the ideas anyway, they had to be selective, as we said, was that they wanted to design a lesson that would include background music. They were going to have break and snack halfway through the lesson. They thought that this was going to help with their learning. And frankly, the teachers were a bit uncertain about this, as I was going to be, because the lesson was only half an hour, but this idea came from the students. They wanted to have a choice of activity. So rather than the teacher saying, okay, for this lesson, you all have to write a poem about internet safety. No, they were going to be given choice of what activity they were going to do. And they were going to do partner work with children choosing their partners. So in the past, teachers were saying who is going to work with whom. They said for this lesson, they wanted to choose their own partners. So the lesson was taught first in year 4, and all these ideas were embedded in the lesson. So as I said, they had background music during some tasks, and they also gave them choice of activities. So they reminded them about internet safety, and they were given a choice either to write a poem or to do a quiz or to prepare like a rap song, hip hop song, some did, or to do a drawing about this. So they had this option, but they could choose who to work with when they were going into pairs. And the lesson was taught in year 4, the youngest one first. So whilst the lesson was taught, the 2 teachers, because there were 3 teachers and 9 researchers that developed the lesson. So one teacher was teaching, the student researchers were taking part in the lesson in that class, and the other student researchers with the other 2 teachers were observing whilst the lesson was taking place. And we as researchers were also observing. And at the end, the student researchers also gave small questionnaires to the class to see what they thought about this lesson. And here what you see, the pieces of paper, it's those questionnaires. So did you enjoy this lesson? Did you think the background music helped? Did you not? So they were analyzing that. But to come back to this idea of the dialogue and to think about what we discussed earlier, you can see here, even though the lesson was designed with the activities they suggested, they started thinking differently when they saw it in action. So they had suggested this idea of the snacks halfway through. So the first boy said, I found the snacks not proper because some people just came back from the breaks and they already had snacks. It made some people keep eating snacks. And that was their idea originally. So they became much more reflective when they saw the lesson, they observed it. And then another girl who was observing, she said, yes, most of them were positive, but there were two girls they weren't really talking about. They weren't talking. So the teacher steps in and says, so do you think we could have done anything to help them to communicate more? So this student noticed two girls that were not taking part. And remember, these lessons are supposed to reach out to all children. So immediately they asked them, could we have done something more? So this boy says, maybe they could have done the work, partner work, if they wanted to choose the partners. Some people just wanted to do work on their own, not having anybody else that might be distracting. So whereas originally they wanted pairs and to choose who to work with, they thought that actually this might make it difficult for some children and not being able to work. So they then made changes to the second lesson, which was also giving them the option who to work with. So the changes to the second lesson was that children could choose to work on their own, with a partner, or even with a group of 3. So they could do that. So they discussed a lot. I only showed you an extract about what could help everybody take part in this lesson. So they thought some people prefer on their own, some in pairs and some in trios. They also changed the way that the tables were set up because they were changing the option of how to work. And they also focused a bit more about the resources that were going to be used, the scissors and the papers were going to be on the tables because they noticed that it was distracting when they had to go and get the papers and the scissors that they needed. So they started focusing on these details of the lesson to refine the lesson and to make it inclusive for all children. So the second lesson was taught, and then at the end, again, they collected everybody's views, and then they analyzed it to make changes for the final lesson. And by the last lesson, they decided that the snack halfway through was really distracting because the teachers had to go around and give them a snack halfway through. So they decided they were not going to have it at all. They also thought of something new. So this came from the students themselves, that having a no-hands approach was going to help with their involvement. So instead of a teacher asking a question and everybody putting their hand up if they wanted to answer that question, they suggested something that the school was using sometimes, that nobody is allowed to put their hands up. So the teacher is going to ask without expecting children to put their hand up, because they said this makes them being more active in their learning and being prepared that I can be asked at any time. And I have to say, as an observer, that observing all 3 lessons, that last lesson, you could see that they were much more engaged because they were not, okay, if I put my hand up, the teacher will ask me. So they were all very alert for answering the teacher. And they only used the background music only during thinking time. So they felt that in the previous 2 lessons, that having the background music throughout the whole lesson was a bit distracting for some children. So they only left it for thinking time that the teacher was giving them in order to allow better concentration for those children that needed it. So at the end of these 3 lessons, the school and these teachers identified 3 areas, 3 lessons in order to make lessons more inclusive. So the first one was to give students more choice of activities. So they found that this really helped, not just telling them, you're all going to write a poem. They were giving them a choice of activities. Also, to allow them to make choices about who to work with, and also use the no-hands approach to allow for more participation from the children. So, having worked with these children, I want to give you an example of the impact that this approach had on student researchers. So I'm going to show you 3 children that were children researchers last year and what they tell us about what the impact was on them, as well as first they tell us what advice they give to teachers if they're going to be training students to be researchers. So I need to go to the English one now. So these are year 4, year 5, and year 6 students from last year who were trained as researchers. So first they tell us what advice do they give to teachers for future children researchers. We tried it earlier and it was working. We checked it, yeah, I know. Do you think because it was my USB, we saved it on the machine?
Oh, maybe.
So it could be. Okay.
Just the video. And the
So here.
guys. Yes, yes.
Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I think methods is a good one because, for example, when a teacher comes into the room and asks the children questions, the clever people will put their hands up more, so the other people that don't have as much confidence don't get to have their chance or their say, if you want to say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when instead of that, when the teacher asks a question, no hands up, so everybody will have their own say and they will have to think outside the box, knowing what they're going to say and how they're going to say it. So that's what I think.
Choose randomly.
Mm-hmm.
I think when people do put their hands up, choose the lower confident people or the lower ability people, because because if you just rely on the smarter people, then you know that they're going to get their answer right. So maybe choose the lower confident people because they'll have to grow to be confident.
Yeah.
And building on what Asier said, maybe when you have some smart people and some not as smart people, do this, but you can help the higher ability ones, but try to help the lower abilities more, because then they get to be like the smarter people being smarter instead of using the better resources, like if you're stranded, but use all of your people instead of just using the better ones.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't just use them. You should help the lower confidence people to get higher confidence, so then they can be like the other people.
That's good advice.
They may want to be.
Is there anything else that you think you could say to teachers about the project, about how they could choose researchers in their class? Or
Yeah, I think choose the lower confident people because then they'll grow to be more confident.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you can only choose 3 people, choose the one higher confidence, one maybe that's not sure, if not a lower confidence, and then a lower confidence. because then you can build the low confidence people. And if you need to talk in front of a bunch of people, then you have, if the low confidence people are still lower confidence, then you still have that higher confidence to talk, and yourself, obviously.
How do you think it affected your confidence, this project?
Massively.
Yeah.
I couldn't even talk in front of 2 people unless they were my close friends or family that I knew well, like knew to like the soul who they were, and I could trust with all my heart. I could trust with my life.
And now
I could just
the whole entire universe.
yeah. Now I could just talk to a million strangers like it was like my
Your
best friend.
friends, yeah.
Like it was my best friend. Like
Because I never used to want to talk to people who I didn't know. Like, it was too scary. It just didn't make me feel comfortable. But now you can bring a stranger off the street, and I'll happily have a conversation with them. It's just
don't
Shit.
kidnap him though.
Yeah.
That's just wrong.
My confidence has grown a lot since we started.
Do you feel more confident talking in front of others now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not like fully confident, but more.
That's really good.
Is it working? Yeah, it's working. This was from last year, and I happened to interview these kids a couple of weeks back, a year later, and they still say the same things. So as I said, this researcher was chosen because they were seen as hard to reach. I'm not going to say who was doing what, but those were the children that one of those 3, I was warned he's going to run out because we've tried everything in school and he doesn't want to take part in anything. And since the project, he's staying in class and the teachers are pretty confident it's because of this role as a researcher. All 9 of them came also to the university and they spoke to a group of 80 students like I am doing here today, and they were absolutely fantastic. So what we've seen is that it's making a big impact on specifically those who are chosen to be researchers. And you can see even the children themselves are saying, if you only have to choose 3, choose ones that are not very confident, ones that you want to give them more opportunities. But our aim is to train many students as we go along in the project and to give opportunities to all children. So far, because as I said, this is an ongoing project, it's only the 2nd year of the project, we saw that how both children and children researchers, 4 lessons, they focus on details that mattered, that might have gone unnoticed otherwise. And in that sense, we make the point that these lessons became more inclusive in the sense that it allowed children participation. I've got a quote there from the head teacher of the particular school who came and observed one of the lessons. And he noticed that when the children were given options to work in trios or in pairs or individually, there were 3 boys in one of the lessons that got together, and he said they would never put those 3 together because the teachers always think, oh, these are going to be the naughty ones, let's not put them together. And he couldn't believe how well they worked and how good the work that they produced was. So just to sum up, part of the argument, as I started with journeys, and I want to finish with journeys, I started with bus journeys, is that students and teachers, practitioners, there are many other people in schools, embark on different journeys all the time. And I see these as collaborative journeys that can be useful for reaching out to all children and creating schools that are the more inclusive. And this idea of dialogue with students, I see it as a distinctive approach to inclusive education. But I have to say that, as I hope I have illustrated, it empowers students, it empowers teachers, and transforms schools. This idea of transformation is never easy. So it takes time to build this kind of ways of working and making changes in schools. And I've got a quote there from Michael Fielding that it says that this transformation requires total change of the ordinary, of the ways that we work usually. But this means changing roles, what it means to be a student, a primary school child, observing the lesson and telling the teacher what changes need to be made. And the teachers were very impressed about the things they were saying, but it's making this relationship changing and making them seeing that their views really matter in school. But as I said, it's not always straightforward, and it takes time to develop these kind of questions. So I always say that children's voices, dialogues with students, are a way of shaking the waters, and I'm saying, are you ready to be involved in these approaches in order to develop more inclusive approaches? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Messiou, for your conference. It has been very interesting. Now it's time to ask the professor our questions. But to coordinate the question, I prefer that you be in my place. Badago galderarik, orain dau momentua, bai?
Si alguien quiere preguntar algo, lo puede hacer en euskera o castellano y yo se lo puedo traducir.
Sabéis que la presentación realmente está hablando sobre el diálogo, sobre la importancia de haber alumnado. ¿Habéis entendido el mensaje general? Me gustaría saber, ¿no? ¿Qué cuestiones puede plantear eso?
Bye? Bye. Why? Okay. Hi, Kiki. I'd like to know how, in this kind of research, how you solve the ethical issues. Ethical issues, working with children in research, how do you solve ethical issues?
Is it? I think it's working now. Okay, thanks, Nekani, for the question. Well, ethics is a big issue when you're working with children. In the UK, in order to conduct any research, not just this kind of research, you need to get ethical approval from the university, which states specifically what methods you're going to use. So this would apply even if it was just the use of a questionnaire or just standard interviews. So it's much more difficult to get ethical approval. So the first step is to get ethical approval from the university. And as part of that ethical approval, we need to demonstrate what procedures we're going to follow in order to make sure that we have been ethical. And for this particular project, one of the first things was to inform all the parents in the participating schools about the project and get approval from individual parents for children to take part. So we have to produce different forms that the parents have to approve. So I'm working with 6 schools at the moment. Only one parent of the 6 schools said they don't want their child to take part in the process. So all the parents were happy with this. And then when I am working with children, I also ask them to sign a form to show that they're happy to be interviewed, to be recorded. So each of the children has the right to do that. But even for that child that their parents didn't approve her participation, the lessons still take place. It's just that I cannot interview them as a researcher because the lessons are part of the school work. So the parents are very clear about this. It's just that they cannot take part. But I think for me, the form and the completion of it, it's very important, and every university has its own procedures. But for me, this is only part of the ethics procedures. So for me, more important is to be ethical towards the children, and part of the reason of using the various methods is a way of respecting their individuality, respecting the fact that they have the right to not take part, not come to the filming if they don't want. So we totally respect what the children are saying. But we definitely have to have the formal ethical approvals. And each of the countries followed similar procedures depending on their own context. But the formal one is one step. And then for me, the most important is what we do when we are there. So we got the children's approval to use this video, to use their pictures. So that's all been agreed, and with the children themselves.
Hi, I would like to ask if you have seen differences, significant differences between different countries in the result.
It's a very good question. This is an ongoing process. As I said, the example I used was from last year, which we were piloting the process. And now this year, the whole year, we are working in each country with 6 schools. That's why it's 5 different countries. And we're meeting in June to analyze all of this. So I cannot say. We visited the hub partner schools, and what I personally can see, there are definitely differences in cultures. So in the UK, I would say that if you visit a school, you'll find that the relationships are a bit more formal between teachers and children. Whereas in Spain, for example, and our school, our partners in Spain is in Madrid, we've seen, and in the previous project we work with secondary schools, the relationships are much more relaxed and more friendly between teachers and children. Having said that, I can talk about the previous project. Similar issues emerge in the different countries. So children want to feel more part of the lesson in Spain, Portugal, and the UK. That's from the previous project. So the similarities were more common. There were more rather than differences. And just to give an example in terms, again, I'm using example from the previous project because this is ongoing and we're still making sense of all of it. And we are getting together to look at the data in June, as I said, is that the more relaxed sometimes might be a barrier. So in one of the schools that we worked with in the previous project, in a secondary school, the students expressed the view that teachers were late going to the class because they were still having their coffee in the staff room. So the children said they were missing time from their lesson. So that was one of the changes that they requested. Now, this wouldn't come up in a school in the UK. Everything works, with the time. So this is not to say we saw lovely talks between teachers and children. So that's why I'm saying it's very complex, but it's an excellent question. And that's something we are monitoring. Or, for example, that's again me talking now. We always thought that, Denmark was very open, democratic. And we found that the schools we're working with right now are finding these approaches very innovative. So that's something we are monitoring, but I cannot really say that I've noticed some difference at this stage. The commonalities are more than the differences. And every school and every country has followed the same procedure, and that's for the research purposes. But it's an excellent question, and it needs a lot more analysis, which is what we're keeping our eye on. I don't know if Mel, do you want to add anything on this? Okay, I've got one of my colleagues, so I thought maybe that's the view, but absolutely crucial question. Thanks for the question.
What role does the students' family have in this project?
Another interesting question, because we're working with a group of researchers yesterday. In this specific project, we are working only with schools, teachers, and the children in the schools. So the families do not have an active role. And this is something we've discussed with the researchers yesterday, because I know you do lots of work with families as to how they can be involved in this process. In the past, in other projects we've done, we had sometimes parents coming in and interviewing children researchers, let's say, but not in this project. We just stayed with, so the families are all aware in all the countries, in all the schools. They know about the project and they're all very interested, but they do not take part in the research process as such. But that would be another interesting dimension, which we've discussed yesterday, as to the role of families, and maybe even, especially because we see significant changes in these researchers' participation, children researchers, to have the family perspective if they've noticed anything. So thank you for that. That's another interesting dimension. Thank you.
Sí. Creo que ya es la hora, ¿verdad? Tenéis clase. They have to go to class.
Okay, okay.
Yes, they are looking
It's the next slot, yes.
So
yeah,
I think we are.
If anybody wants leaflets, there's here. I gave some, but there's more here for you to take. So thanks for your attention. Good luck with your exams. I understand everybody is very stressed with exams, as my students are in the UK. But thanks for your attention and for your questions as well. And thanks to Miriam. I want to find out about this. Wow, it's impressive. It's impressive. Thank you. And to the sign interpreters as well, and for your work. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I told you, I was so